Welcome everybody to the latest episode of Breaking the Silence, a conversation where the aim has been so far, and I hope you'll all agree that we've had some brave souls step forward and tell their stories, and that's what I want to do, really break the silence, hence the name, and they're sort of relaxed conversations. I hope you'd agree. And today it brings me absolute pleasure to introduce Fergus. Fergus is an ex-NHS nurse and worked from 2003 up until the start of the pandemic, let's say 2020 December time, and we'll talk about why his career ended at that point in the interview. But prior to that, did lots of other projects that Fergus will tell you about. So no further ado, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. Can you tell us a little bit about your career? I've just touched on it. You've worked for almost 20 years as a nurse. Can you tell us a bit about your CV and your? It's
Yeah,
not a job
sure.
interview, by the way. It's not a job interview.
That's fine. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I worked in the NHS from 2000. Well, I worked in the NHS from 1999, actually, in my early 30s until the end of 2020. And I went in there having always, before that, worked in different businesses for a few years at a time in clerical jobs. And I want to talk about my background in a minute because I think that's going to be helpful to what I'm about to say. But then I did City and Guilds level 2, City and Guilds level 3 as a healthcare assistant in a very busy hepatology medical ward at a hospital, a big major hospital in the UK. And it was a good hospital. I believe I worked with really good people, mainly in the days when we had, I think, looking back, really high standards of holistic and relatively scientific care and quite detailed attention to sort of each aspect of being a person, and looked after people pretty well. We certainly had got lots of things wrong as well. And then I decided to go on and I was doing well, so I got secondment from my trust to go and be to do the Nursing and Midwifery Council registered pre-reg nursing program, which I did. And then I worked as a registered nurse in hospitals in busy medical situations all that time, a little bit of community practice as well.
So you've worked your apprenticeship really, haven't you? You've gone from the bottom all the way through. Did you ever get into sort of management positions or?
Yeah, interestingly, I didn't really want to. I felt that, like, as a band five, as a senior band five, we had to use lots of leadership skills, and I did a degree course in mentoring and that kind of thing. And I never ever wanted to work up the ladder because I could see that even one step up the ladder, it was very good in terms of you'd have more organizational control in terms of staffing or staff welfare, or making sure everything's ship shape on the ward in a bigger bigger picture way. But also I could see that as soon as you step up, you have to be involved in some corporate limiting constraints that didn't really appeal to me too much. I say limiting just because we were increasingly moving into a more corporate idea, and things were becoming more standardized, which in one way is good if the standards are good, but in another way, they become rather less personal to the individual patient. So yeah, I never really appealed. I did step up a little bit into it, and I used to be in charge of a ward. We used to take that in turns, and I loved it, but also I kind of really wanted to be right next to the patient. That was really important to me.
No, that sounds that's why you went to nursing, isn't it? You want to be
Yeah,
helping
yeah,
patients, funnily enough, and this is one of the strange reminders in this post-COVID era, let's say, that what happened to that inherent wish to help people. I mean, I guess that's why you
yeah,
went from what you were doing to the healthcare initially and then into nursing, that inherent wish to
yeah.
help hands-on.
Don't get me wrong. I think obviously management. I think management is a really important thing. It obviously it's part of healthcare. We need good management, but we need management that is clinically competent and understands what healthcare is really about. And things fall apart without good management. So uh,
Just digging
yeah,
into that, what is your experience of NHS management? Is it top heavy? Is it run by non-clinical people, or are there people that have gone up the ladder that have been at the bottom and worked their way up? What's your experience from your career in that respect from management?
Yeah, well, certainly back then at the beginning, in my time, it was you'd work gradually up. If you were in nursing, you may then go for a junior charge nurse or junior sister role, get experience doing that, and then gradually become what they call a ward manager. And the ward manager was basically a senior charge nurse or senior sister. And I thought it worked pretty well because it was all based on all the nurses were all together. We were all kind of classed ourselves as equals, no matter what level you were at in a way. And so we all were all singing from the same book. And it was all very patient focused. But then I could see beyond that, it got remote, really remote from the patient or from things. But what I did see was a change gradually coming in, which is really concerning, away from a very compassionate, more human based approach to any staff issues or problems, from a sort of, you could tell, a mandated, um, what would you call it? Um, Fixed approach to problems. So, for example, if there was a concern about a member of staff that perhaps they'd done something which wasn't ideal, or it was possibly a safeguarding issue which needed to be investigated. Back in the early day, this didn't happen very much, but occasionally things happen. In where I worked, anyway, in some places it happens all the time, sadly. But it would be dealt with very, very well, and with great sensitivity and care for the dignity of that member of staff. No one else would know about it, and it would be processed properly. They give their statements and so on. But then, increasingly, when it did ever happen, it was like this person was marched off the ward in public, and they were banned from working for a few days, and it was all done really, really badly. And actually, I know firsthand experience, there was two people who hadn't done anything wrong, and they were treated in a terrible manner.
And it is that shift, isn't it, Fergus, between, like you said, the sensitivity of the situation and presumption of innocence switched
Yeah,
completely now. And we're seeing that with my career and all the other COVID dissenters, that immediately you're guilty as charged without any evidence being heard, and it's guilty till proven innocent. And bearing in mind we are healthcare staff and we should be caring for each other as well as our patients, that seems to have dissolved from the profession, that holistic care of each other, that team mantra, man down kind of scenario. And I've watched that disappear in my short career as well.
most certainly. It's very, very sad. And I think that anybody who is still in there, I mean, I think I don't know what goes on in the NHS now, really, but I'm sure there are a lot of people who have a real soul and really want to do it, but it is difficult
Mm.
for them
We
to.
we were talking pre-record about sort of what's changed over the career. We touched on a few of the points now, but what in terms of staff's kind of ability to appraise, critically think, debate, be questioned, what's happened over your sort of 20-year career?
Yeah, I think it was certainly when I joined. I don't think it was fantastic. There was a sort of top-down teaching. These are the facts, and there was a very heavy emphasis, which is a good thing, on research. You've got to look at the research, and all nurses had some basic training in critically reviewing papers on a basic level. Not obviously in the pure sciences like biology or chemistry or maths or something, but in more the social science or holistic nursing care, or procedural techniques, or evidence for certain treatments. But in reality, the level of training wasn't that high. Probably wasn't time for it, and also there certainly wasn't time to do it. So in reality, I don't think many healthcare professionals really have the opportunity to really examine the evidence properly. They're far too busy. They're working really long shifts. Then they're exhausted, tired out, go home, and then they probably have a television in their room telling them what the government are telling them, and then their skills are either zero or very poor in doing that. So I think we've got a difficult situation going on there. So I think that's always been the case, but I think it must have got worse, possibly in some ways, or maybe there's been some changes in pharmacological medicine which have managed to come through, and then that level of scrutiny hasn't been there. So they've managed to come through and be problematic.
Yeah, and we've seen that in the COVID era, really, and I think we're going to go into a bit more detail as to what led to that sort of decision in 2020 to walk away from it, or pushed. I don't know. We'll come to that. It depends.
Yeah.
So yeah, take us through that. So the pandemic starts. Over to you. What was your account? You were in the front line. You were nursing at the time, and then suddenly this bat-eating virus, apocalyptic, people dropping in Bergamo like Derek Trotter in the bar on Fools and Horses, and people being scooped up off the pavement. What were you seeing? What were the hospitals like?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, as we all would say, that if that was happening, and the news reports of that happening, obviously it's extremely serious. But may I just, before answering that question, give a bit of background, because I think it will help to answer the question a bit better. I'm going to go back to the age of 18. When I was about 17 or 18, it was beginning to occur to me that there's this news out there, So I'd be trying to work out what's going on in the world and how does it all work? And I'm beginning to take an interest in reading news. And I began really quickly early on to see that I was never hearing about vast parts of the world or Africa or South America and things. So I began, what's going on there as a question mark? And then I began to realize I could go to different media sources and learn a little bit more. It's before the internet days. And then a friend later on in life talked to me. The television was on, and she said, "Oh, that'll be a news blank." And I thought, "What's a news blank?" And that made me think. And then the I began to realize, as I homed in on certain media channels, different papers, that they said, "Oh, we're giving the complete news. Now we give an independent perspective." And having followed that for ages, then I began to realize they're not. They've got their own narrow perspective. So I was asking these questions: Are we really getting told the truth? How do we really know what the big picture is? And then I worked in accounts and finance for a long time, and I did a HNC in business and finance, and that required me to be very, very exacting. I worked my first job actually, which I haven't talked about before, the NHS, was in a finance company, and it was a very busy company branch, and it was fantastic. It's probably the best job I've had in many ways. The training was amazing. I wasn't allowed to lose one penny or gain one penny, and I was dealing with thousands of pounds of cash as the only cashier, and I had to deal with all these bank transactions and stuff. So that was a really good training and being absolutely accurate. And then in nursing, it was the same. So I had this whole background in number one, what's really going on? I'm asking questions. And even back at school, if I was told something, I'd be going, but why? I was a bit like that. And then I had to be very exacting about things. At the start of my nursing profession, when I was in college, I was introduced various things which were so-called facts, and immediately I was going, but why? And going back to what I thought before, said before, I didn't really have time to properly research them. I was always trying to get time to do a proper deep dive into this, that, and the other, and you wouldn't have time. And the NHS is run on people who don't have training. They do not have time to really do deep dives into really important things going on. And there was a mention of our wonderful Dr. Andrew Wakefield, with the whole MMR thing going on at the time. And the question marks were going on in me that, I mean, he was being classed as a criminal doctor at the time, which he absolutely is not. I followed that all the way through, and he was completely cleared at the High Court of England and Wales after 15 or 20 years of being hated by the press and the General Medical Council for doing absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever. And so then coming forward to the pandemic time in 2020, basically what happened, I just joined the Royal the hospital I was in. I don't know whether I should mention names of hospitals, so I won't. That's fine. And early on, there was this news coming through that there's a major spread of a really dangerous disease, and it was in China, Wuhan, China, and it was spreading. And there was fear of a pandemic, not of a pandemic, but fear of it spreading. And then gradually the news built up, didn't it? And it was clearly spreading around the world, and we were getting television reports and videos of people uh, dying in hospitals and all the rest of it. And then while I was working in the hospital, this was all taken really seriously. And I remember one moment when the nursing sister on the ward I was on just came up and she said, "Oh, I've just been chatting to the doctor in ITU downstairs, and he said we're all going to get it, we're all going to die." And at that point, I'll forget all my dates, but at that point, we're all being asked to gown up more in so-called protective gear, to varying degrees, wearing masks and sometimes helmets, depending on the situation we're in clinically, and different degrees of protection of our own body and the air we are breathing with different kinds of masks, depending on the situation. And that went on, and then gradually, as this very heavy news was coming through from the BBC, etc., and from our corporate directives, updates on this, how we needed to tackle this. They were calling it a virus that was spreading, lots of people were dying, and we needed to have this social isolation, so we kept far apart as we could from each other. And that was all absolutely crucial, all this stuff. In the middle of that, I can't remember the exact timing, I only had a year there, but gradually we were emptying the hospital of patients. And so some of them were being sent home. Elderly people were being discharged as well. I think they were being discharged. I didn't get the details of this. There'll be other people who know much more about the detail, but maybe to nursing homes.
But the clearing of the decks is what you're saying. Just clear.
Clearing of the decks. Yeah. But also at the same time, so we had an increasingly empty hospital in the middle of a pandemic, they said. Now, one of my many observations was that if we're in the middle of a pandemic of the spread of a really dangerous pathogen, which we've not got resistance to, let's call it that, there would be people keeling over in the streets. There'd be people trying to stumble away to hospital, dying outside the hospital, or being very sick outside the hospital. We'd have hospital corridors with people, being very ill, and we wouldn't be able to get to them. And we'd have very full wards of patients. And that absolutely was the opposite that was happening where I worked. And then not only that, we were drafting in, because we had a staffing crisis. So we'll come all onto this, won't we? But we had a staffing crisis because staff were going off sick, but these staff were well. They basically had to do the PCR swab test on themselves, which indicated that they were so-called COVID positive, fit and well, but they had to stay at home and self-isolate. So we had a staffing crisis as well, of insufficient staff, empty beds, and then we were drafting in kind volunteers from left, right, and centre, places within the NHS allegedly that weren't so urgent. So, for example, certain dental practices, or left, right, and centre, anywhere where you could get staff. So we had a draft in of, say, retired doctors, nurses who'd retired, etc., and a range of people who are really well out of practice and maybe had worked in the NHS as a nurse or a healthcare assistant in the past, but certainly weren't ready up for running or qualified to really work in a hospital with sick people. And then lots of people were very competent, and lots of these people we had hardly any patients for quite a while, so we're all just standing around drinking coffee.
Well, normally, I mean, as you probably back me up on, the principle of normally one-to-one nursing. I mean, particularly the higher up the sickness scale you are, but normally if you're in an A&E situation nowadays, one nurse is looking after five, six, seven, eight patients at the same time. But obviously with my own eyes, and I presume you were too, is it was completely flipped. So you'd have three or four. I remember visiting a COVID ward once, and there were five nurses sat around a quality street tin with one patient in traction from a neck of femur fracture. And I'm like,
That was
well,
in
he's obviously not
2020.
got COVID, but this sudden
Yeah.
flip between five nurses to one patient, it was very odd. But
Yeah.
like you say, they're drafting in these people to look after the sick and needy that just weren't coming into the hospital. Like you say, you'd
Yeah,
expect, something
definitely.
apocalyptic or Netflix-like to be presenting itself, but you never got that gist ever, that peak ever happened, or
Right. As I recall it, so I did keep notes as I went, but at some point the hospital was gradually filling up again, and I don't know how that timed in with what was going on in terms of during that year, what was going on in the, the public health um, requirements and so on. But gradually we were filling up again. But at no time in the whole of my year in 2020 did I see. I was working on the bank, so which meant I had the privilege of working in many different hospital departments. The only place, including A&E, I did some A&E work. The only places I never really worked was theatres, and because I never specialised in um, intensive care nursing or high dependency, although I did do a certain amount of high dependency at a ward level. Um, I didn't work in ITU and I didn't work in those areas. So as I went around the hospital in many different departments, when we were relatively empty of patients, and then gradually as we filled up with patients, I never saw anybody. And by the way, I also worked in areas of the hospital which had been marked out as for people who were sick with COVID or had COVID positive tests, and then green areas, I think we called them, where there was no testing. And I only met my normal range of people who were sick for various reasons, but nothing that I saw that I could particularly say was very different. Um, but I'm sure there were. I think COVID was a real thing, and there is a real thing out there. I think there was something going on, definitely, and some people were more sick with respiratory problems and other issues. This is all before the rollout of the. I don't call it vaccination because it isn't a vaccination. Got to be clear about that. But before the rollout of the COVID jab or the COVID technology, the injected technology,
they
as
call it the
people call it,
poison dart.
it does seem to be.
But yeah, so it's mad, really. So again, these are all conspiracy theories. Your lived experience, my lived experience of empty hospitals are both conspiracy theories, as well as even daring to say it's not a vaccine, even though it says it on their own company documentation that it's a gene therapy.
Yeah.
As I said before, there's not a lot therapeutic about it, in that it doesn't work and it's not very safe, despite the claims. But so,
Yeah.
what was the talk on the streets, as it were? What were your colleagues saying? So you've got these questions, you're scratching your head, wondering where's the pandemic? Were your colleagues
Yeah.
of similar conspiratorial thinking?
Yeah, that was very interesting. Just before answering that, I just want to add into something I was saying before about um, always finding, asking questions quite important. I think it's a real. Somebody said to me once, always hold a question mark over everything. It's just a really healthy thing to do. And something else that I always noticed in hospital, there was a certain level of arrogance. I mean, I'm perfectly capable of being arrogant myself and think I'm great when I'm not. But I always remember one incident that was a really good example where this hospital consultant, when I worked in medicine for the elderly, which I did probably a third of my career, and he making this great pronouncement over this lady to her family, saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but she's never going to get out of bed again. You know, that's it. I'm really sorry to bring you that news." And I was there doing my medicine round, thinking that lady is most certainly going to get out of bed again, because I just knew as a nurse she would, and she was out of bed that morning. And it's just one of these examples where there's this sort of non-scientific statements that can be made about people. But yeah, the answer on this, the conversation around, so there was two conversations. At that time I was so concerned, and I was beginning to read a huge amount that was not being presented to me by the mainstream media. And what I noticed on the mainstream media was extremely simplistic conversation. Um, so that led me to do lots and lots of reading from evidently very, very intelligent people in the know, included though there was writing coming in, wasn't there, from the heads of every profession. So I was in the hospital professionally thinking, things aren't right, things aren't as we're being told. So I believed it was my professional duty to speak with patients and raise their awareness of concerns I had about the PCR technology that were clearly there. The talk of a vaccination, evidence of their, was there really a pandemic at all? Was there any evidence for it? And all this kind of conversation. And I just remember that most patients were going, yeah, there's something not right. There's something not right. We're smelling rotten eggs, and I just met a vast amount of people, and that was with staff as well. There was quite a lot of staff who were going, yeah, there's something not right, isn't there? And then there was a few members of staff and the odd patient who would be just believing everything they were told. But they seem to be, maybe it's because of where I live or something. I've just met a lot of people who mainly are thinking there's something up. And then outside of my job, around and about, and be having loads of conversations everywhere I went. I would be like talking to people next to me on the train or on the bus or in the street or whatever, because that's kind of me. I like meeting people, and most people were thinking there's something not adding up with all this. But there was also a lot of fear, and people were also believing what was being told by them on the news. So there's slight confusion, because that was a very, very powerful, well-designed public health, in the name of public health, communications being used on people. It's another story, isn't it?
Yeah, there's some very specialist psychological techniques, and there were units that were admitting to doing it as well. You've got nudge units, they call them nudge units, and Spy B, and all these governmental agencies that were keeping the message fearful. We had the yellow and the black, the trilogies, hands, face, space, and be scared of people, stand 6 meters apart, and all of this. It was all fear, fear, fear. And doctors and nurses are human. They absorb that fear as well. And when you're scared, you don't make critical judgments as well. So
Yes.
strange old
Yeah.
time. Did you have any sort of allies on the front line that were of your persuasion, questioning, shall I say, or critically thinking, researching
Yeah.
you?
Yeah. And just going back to what you just said, of course, there's nothing when people at the time, there was this use of the buzzword, the conspiracy theorist. We'll come to that, won't we? But there's nothing conspiracy theorist about what you've just said. This was
Mhm.
very clearly analysed by very intelligent people. That sort of government government public health messaging techniques and so on. So yeah, everything. Yeah. So yeah, in terms of whether other people were critically thinking, it was difficult to say, because in hospital time was very short. Um, I think as the conversations developed, um, we didn't really get into any in-depth conversations about, getting out the research or whatever. And earlier on, when we had not not many patients at all. I can't actually remember the conversations at that time uh, with staff, but there was nothing really in depth. I did certainly. I think it was just a general hunch that things weren't right. I wasn't coming in. I certainly wasn't coming into hospital with my big pile of
Conspiracies.
things written by conspiracy theorists like Dr. Cartland and people like that.
So
um,
I think one of the big eureka moments for you was this PCR testing, like you said, you touched on it
yeah,
earlier about,
yeah,
there were well people going home because they got this positive test
yeah,
that the lab was telling them they were sick when they're absolutely fine and being given 2 weeks off in the garden, and it was really nice weather, wasn't it?
yeah,
And people were on furlough and everyone was having a great old time. So
yeah.
for people who don't know, this is a conspiracy theory according to those on the pro-vax COVID cultists, I call them now, but. Um,
Right.
this PC, I want to try and carefully explain. So I'm going to let a second person, explain what is PCR, what do they use it for, and what was your concern about it?
Well, first of all, of course, I'm not a scientist in that kind of way, but I did get very concerned because through all the reading I was doing through all these very intelligently written articles by very, very senior health professionals who've been health professionals for decades, doctors, nurses, and these are
Including
people.
the inventor, I'd gather, Carrie Mullis. I'm sure you'd
Carrie
include him
Mullis,
in that.
absolutely, Carrie Mullis himself. And also, what I noticed coming in, because I was reading one great resource, I had one particularly great resource for me, which is where many, many high level people were writing in really strongly evidence based, well reasoned through things based on, not just mantras or simplistic ideas without any discussion, really well rooted things. And so one of the things that popped into my mailbox one morning was it was called the Corman Drosten Review Report. Now, in a nutshell, so I read it all that morning, and in a nutshell, the PCR testing, which was, I believe, really designed by Carrie Mullis, who, by all reports, was a wonderful and very meticulous scientist in his field. He made it really clear and explained really clearly on various direct videos of why the PCR technology cannot be used diagnostically, or it's sort of an extra. You'll correct me on this, Dave, because I'm going to get something wrong, I'm sure. But basically, as I remember, it's the seventh thing you'd ever use if you were trying to diagnose if somebody had a so-called infective disease. And even then, it can't really be used reliably to diagnose. What it does is it shows that it picks up strands of biological material from the back of the nose or the axilla or wherever you're taking it. And then that's analyzed under microscopy or under very special techniques. And then that's amplified to be able to a certain level by cycles, which I don't really understand myself, and then that shows a certain quantity, if you like, would that say,
Well,
of
as you mentioned, it's an amplification process, isn't it, of getting a very small amount of something and amplifying it.
okay, yeah. And so there's quite a lot to this topic, the PCR testing. So basically, the suddenly during 2020, I know for a fact in all my time in nursing, PCR swabbing, which we did, and we did swabbing for various things, like if we were looking for a particularly resistant Staphylococcus aureus on somebody's skin, we did that for various reasons. PCR technology was never used by doctors as a first line approach to diagnose anything. All of a sudden in 2020, it was being used to so-called diagnose somebody to see if they had COVID or not. And there was major concern about this. I've not. This came from a particular group of scientists. I think they were employed in the European Union or something. It was for political reasons. And this Corman-Drosten review report made that really clear, and they presented a really well structured, I've got here, it's about 30 pages of fine print of their concerns about why PCR technology can't be used to diagnose.
So
And
this is not Doris on Facebook, is it? As we get accused of, people trust the science, not Doris on Facebook. This is well researched, well cited, referenced documentation of people who know what they're talking about.
yeah, that's right. These are people who not only know what they're talking about, but they're immersed in it. It's their lifeblood. And this is an important thing to say. These are people who, um, we've been trusting for decades with really important and wonderful decisions in healthcare. These people who have been exposing the, let's just call them, concerns about everything to do with COVID, who are suddenly called criminals or conspiracy, name called, basically, call them what you want. These are the very people who actually have been leading the way in major and wonderful healthcare things, and people don't seem to know that. So anyway, I read this thing, and then that morning I knew that staff were all being asked to do PCR swabbing on themselves. Patients were being PCR swabbed, and this wasn't a reliable test. So we were getting lots of positive results. We're getting some negative results. And every time somebody has a positive result, no matter how fit and well they were or otherwise, they were treated as a case. They were labelled as somebody who had COVID, and COVID was classed as a really serious and dangerous disease. So they would have to be isolated or not allowed to go to work or whatever.
So in real
And
terms, Fergus, so you've got somebody being wheeled in from an ambulance, they've got a fractured neck of femur, or something completely non-respiratory. They'd be swabbed on entry, told they were COVID positive, rather than go off to have their neck of femur fracture orthopedically fixed. They would be then treated as a biohazard.
yeah, yes, exactly. And of course, the staff would be sent home if they were PCR positive. And also, it created, this was the key for me, that I could see from all my studying that the lockdowns, as we called them, the social lockdown of preventing traveling and movement and closing major shopping areas and closing things down, and we all had to be staying in our homes for lengths of time and so on, all around the world all of a sudden.
Unless you're an MP where you could have a cheese and wine evening.
Yeah, quite exactly. um, the As I understood it, and this is how I still understand it, the basis for that was the PCR positive. And as a nurse, my duty, the first thing they taught me in nursing school was to protect the public. And I could see no, putting aside the arguments for or against that approach, if there was an actual pandemic, I couldn't see any evidence of a pandemic anywhere. But even if there was a pandemic, it'd be highly. I read some articles written by very senior military people who that would discuss a plan for what to do if there was a really major pandemic. You wouldn't be closing down the economy. You'd be keeping things running. You'd be keeping your infrastructure alive and running. And most of all, a compassionate society would be visiting the sick and looking after the sick. And when there was genuine pandemics like the bubonic plague or whatever, um, in this country, it would be church people who would they had a plan of action, so that I think one person would then go to that community who were sick. They knew they might die as a result of it, and that would be the whole plan. They would go and look after the sick there, and care for them, or spiritually or whatever. And there's a sort of better plan. So I was completely against lockdown. So I could see lockdown was causing a huge amount of a massive damage to people's health on every single level. It was horrific in
We
itself.
look at we look at when they actually locked us down. It was the day they actually lowered the classification of the disease from high consequence to low consequence. And it was that exact day that was the anniversary of the first lockdown. The day they literally, again, behind, it was very
Yeah.
silently announced that HCID down to LCID, which just means it's the same as any circulating, coronavirus, cold-like upper respiratory tract infection. That was the first day they locked us down. Boris had gone from, he'd been speaking on This Morning and the BBC and saying, this is just, the young, fit and healthy aren't going to get sick from this. It's going to be the moribund, the comorbid patients, the elderly. And then you've got Chris Whitty saying, well, we need to aim for herd immunity. Let's all go out and catch it. And then suddenly on a sixpence, it just changed to this fear mongering and cases. I mean, the deadly disease, it's so deadly, you got a test to check you've got it or not. I mean, it can't be that deadly if you've got to check you got it. And one of the symptoms was no symptoms. The old asymptomatic carriage, whereby you could kill your granny by stealth with these black smoke particles billowing out of your nose. I mean, that was another set of adverts from the NHS, wasn't it, where people were sat on their sofas, bellowing out of their ears and their eyes and their nose, this black smoke, something out of a horror movie. That's how the fear porn took off, really.
Yeah.
But so
Yeah.
the lockdowns, what was your experience
Absolutely.
of lockdown in the NHS? I mean, you were obviously working during those times because it was dead for
Yeah.
me.
So sorry, that was a very long-winded story. So that morning, what happened was that I read that report, we're putting that whole picture together, which I've only begun on. I knew that day that I had to hand in my notice as a registered nurse because if I did, by the way, I didn't swab one single patient except one, and I'll tell you about that. It was horrific, and I shouldn't have done it. And if I did one PCR swab, I never PCR swab myself either. And if I swabbed one single patient, I was directly responsible for the whole of lockdown. Obviously, it wasn't just me, but I had to say I was part of it. And lockdown was killing people and ruining people. And so I was working on the bank, so I just had a few shifts left to do. And I thought, well, I have got savings. I've got a house. Um, I'll survive. And um, this is very sad. But I realised because I thought, well, if I've got to do all these swabs with people, I can't have anything. But so far, I've managed to allow other people to be doing them around me on patients. I never actually said, "Oh, I'm not doing it," which is a blessing. And so it's happening. I couldn't help it happening. And then one morning, on now a full ward of normally sick patients, the nursing sister in this military operation rushed up to me and said, "Oh, Fergus, can you swab this lady? She's not been swabbed." Um, and looking back, I wish I handled it differently. And that was a whole difficult situation on how to actually. Um, that's a different topic, isn't it? It's all about whistleblowing and the right thing to do and how to act wisely. But on that moment, I did actually do that swab of that lady. But I can tell you now what I witnessed was the way PCR swab tests were done was completely outrageous. It was completely unethical anyway to be doing them on people. They were done without consent. They were done without people being trained to do them properly. It's got to be done really carefully and properly. Um, it was quite apart from the. I feel very passionate. Sorry, I'm
Quite
getting
barbaric, to be honest, as well. I mean, you've got a very,
barbaric.
very sensitive
Absolutely,
bit of tissue here up your cribriform plate, right next to where they were wedging. And I've seen
yeah.
people doing it to their kids, and they really are quite violent with it because they were, tickling the
Yeah.
back of your eyeballs with these swabs, essentially.
When I did that one single PCR swab, there's a dear, wonderful little elderly lady, and I'm forgiving myself now, actually, in a way. But I didn't do this. I didn't do the swab. I just basically, as kindly as I could. She was very confused. She had dementia. She couldn't communicate. To get proper informed consent from her could have happened. There's always an element of informed consent you can get. You must. This is another big area I'm passionate about. And so I had very small moments to get some sort of consent. And I don't think and I just sort of tickled a nostril with it, basically.
Mm.
But even that was, yeah. Anyway, so you asked me another question.
I know people as well that have sent off, the swabs to take it straight out the wrapper, snap it, pop it in, and send it off. They've not even touched their human tissue, and
No,
they've come back positive.
Yeah,
Just unbelievable. And we saw that with the lateral flows with water, running tap water, and you can get positive results. So
right.
very sinister, very sinister.
Very sinister. Yeah,
What you touched on whistleblowing, just as a kind of
yeah,
slightly different subject. What's
yeah,
your opinion on how the NHS treats a whistleblower? Would you be
yeah,
confident to whistleblow now?
yeah. This is a all these little topics are huge topics. We could talk for an hour about each one. But yeah, whistleblowing. So I think that the bar, as it were, for effective whistleblowing is very, very low. So what I've worked out by now is that corporations, they have their official policy because it sounds good that we want you and it's genuine as well. You know, organisations want to root out any things that are not right or are harmful to patients or you know, not best practice or worse. And so we're all encouraged to report anything that's worrying. But the problem with it is that it's all based on an evidence basis, which only goes so far. So once you're stepping out of that uh, corporate understanding or that corporate mantra and beginning to question something which isn't widely understood, whistleblowing doesn't work, as you know firsthand.
Mhm.
And so I was in my own dilemma there of it was a really difficult situation for me because I was thinking, do I begin to try and reason with my company? And I felt completely alone. I thought there's, you know, who else out there? You know, I knew there were people in the literature, but I didn't. It was really difficult. The conversations were really slow, and it's really difficult to work out in detail what other people really thought in a lot of detail. So my experience of whistleblowing was that it only goes so far. Um, it's quite a low bar, really. I think you have to be doing something very obviously wrong. Depends where you work. You
Mhm.
know, if you're working in a terrible place where there's abuse happening everywhere, you know, you need. But
Do you
yes,
think the NHS looks after a whistleblower? They actively
no,
encourage it, don't they? They encourage it because we've got, what was called whistleblowing. It's now called freedom to speak up guardianship. You can't get any fluffier and soft as a freedom to speak up guardian. And then you speak to this guardian, and then you
yeah,
face the wrath of the gods and collect your P45 on the way out the door.
I do know. I mean, from my own personal experience, there were times when I'd raised concerns, which were valid concerns, and at one point, I was trying to represent other staff on behalf of patients over a particular issue of staff movements and so on. And I quickly realised that even when you're talking to the representative, say for example the union representative or something, you think they'd be on your side, but really they're just siding with a company which wants to stay comfortable within its own kind of boundaries. Um, and I think it's genuine, a mix of ignorance and going back to what we were talking about earlier, lack of skill and lack of time to really delve into, good, robust research and what's really going on. So I think I don't know what else to say really about whistleblowing. I think that yes, in my own situation, then I was in a big dilemma because I was torn between a rock and a hard place. So on one hand, I could have prepared myself, got all my in very very limited time, working a lot of hours, got my papers together and so on, and then produced a file. I would have had to have done it well, and then arranged an appointment with a senior member of staff or two and said, look, these are my concerns. Can we talk about it? And that would have been very interesting. I think I could have, that would have gone down an interesting route to see how that would have turned out. But the problem then I had was that then I would immediately be a dissenter as well because I wasn't going along. I wasn't going to be PCR swabbing people um, I suppose I could have kept quite private about what I thought in many ways, but then by then presenting my concerns, I obviously wasn't being private. So I decided that there was and then I could just see corporation against Fergus. Um, and I thought, well, where's that going to get anybody? Um, and I don't think there's a right answer. And I think all the people are whistleblowing and like the really important work you do, Dave, is really important. And I think there's another side to it as well. Maybe some of us leave and then try and work from the outside. But I think both are really important.
Well, what's been quite interesting from the experience of doing these interviews so far, these conversations, is every single one of them, but for one that I recorded yesterday, and that was under anonymity. We had to change names because they currently work for the NHS. Everyone else has since left and are speaking freely after leaving, and that speaks volumes, doesn't it? Because it does. You said it before. You felt like a dissenter, and it was you against the machine, and you do get that feeling, that undertone, and it's very clever how they do it. They make you feel like a rebel rouser, a
Yes,
troublemaker, a busybody.
definitely.
One of my interviews a few weeks ago,
Yeah,
the lady was done up for doing too many datexes, which is the system for raising concerns that
I
you're
listen to
actively
that.
encouraged to do until you do, and then you're a troublemaker and you're doing too many of those critical incidents. You're finding blood on people's sheets and people X-raying the wrong arm. People
Yeah,
asking men if they're pregnant, and she just raised genuine concerns
yeah,
and suddenly becomes a troublemaker. So there is that inherent culture that if you do speak out, and the reason they take people like me all the way to the GMC and the NMC and the HCPC, other dissenters, is because it then actively creates that culture of fear. The amount of doctors who come to me and say, you're so brave, Dr. Cartland, well done for doing what you're doing, and then I go back to, why are you not speaking out, Dr. So and so? Say, well, we've seen what they've done to you. We've seen what they've done. Firstly, they mention money and pensions, but the second thing is we've seen what they've done to you. So that process being the punishment, not only for me to shut my trap, but secondly, these people will see, look what they did to Dave Cartland. 3 years they've had him at the GMC, and it's going to be going on for the next 2 or 3 years. If they get their way, it's not a nice process. I can tell you
yeah,
that firsthand. But people on the outside looking in would see that as a deterrent, and that's exactly what it is. And it's the same across all of
yeah.
healthcare that you become this.
Well, I
Kind of,
can see that. I can see that. And I think that anybody who knows what's going on, who's in there, it's not good enough. It's not okay just to say, well, we don't want to do that. You have a duty of care
I wouldn't
to,
mind if I'd had the arm put around me, and from a
yeah,
senior doctor. I mean, one
exactly.
of, one of my senior encounters was with an appraiser, and I retweet this quite often. He's an appraiser who started off, he called me a conspiracy theorist. He said I was down too many rabbit holes, but later on, he warmed up to some of the information that I was sharing with him because he had to read it. And in the end, I mean, he said to me, "Fair play for speaking out." I'll paraphrase the part of the appraisal that he called probity, the probity section, integrity and probity. And he said,
Yeah,
"Fair play for speaking out. We must encourage whistleblowers, but what you really should have done is realise that you worked in the NHS and you should follow what they called consensus opinion." And what you should have done, Dave, and he put this in black and white, it was wonderful. You should have kept your head down and shrugged your shoulders. It's the exact phrase one of the most senior doctors in the Cornwall area said to me. And he put it in black and white. And for me, that was a big vindication that, this is what senior doctors are saying. Shrug your shoulders about patient safety concerns, ethical breaches, evidence-based issues and matters. And then the big one for me was going for pregnant women and children. There's absolutely no argument for that gene jab to be going into their arms at all. These people weren't succumbing to this deadly apocalyptic disease at all, at all. But I was going to ask you some quick fire questions. I don't know whether you've had
yeah.
experience of any of these things, but first I was going to ask, did you get offered the jab? And what was your response to that? And
That's
oh,
an interesting question. Um, yeah, was I ever offered the oh yes, I suppose multiple times by um, was it by text because I've got NHS I'm registered with GP.
so you'd left the building at that point, so they were coming after you
Oh
about
yeah, so
patients.
yes, I knew I could see right back at the beginning, they're going to be doing something with a vaccination on this, and I was anyway. So I'd left before the yeah, because that was 2021, wasn't it?
Mhm.
So there was nothing there for me. But as a member of the public, I was being offered, or I wouldn't say offered, but I think the wording actually was required even sometimes. I can't remember exactly. I've got them all here somewhere. Yeah, and I didn't reply. I didn't reply to those things. I thought the wisest thing to do with people who don't know what they're talking about or dangerous people is to be silent sometimes. So no, and then so I was never offered it. So I wasn't. I was out of the NHS before the time when NHS staff were being required to have it. But I
Mandated,
was
weren't they? It was mandated for them to have it.
Yes, but I was in touch with people, closely with people in that situation, in conversation with people who, very brave people who I met through a training course I did afterwards, who were in that situation, knowing a vast amount of NHS staff didn't want it, wasn't it?
Massive amounts, so 100,000 plus.
Yes. Um, and yes, and so I know the accounts of the experiences they had. They were one person was telling me that it was just um, she was treated as a criminal by all her colleagues because she wasn't going to have it, and she knew she might have to lose her job, and because um, but I was out before then. I just remember trying to support people with that, and then, of
What were
course.
your concerns about the jab? What made you say no? What was the
And of course, as well, we have it on video documentation, not just writing, that the massive amount of these huge peaceful marches going in, and the amount of letter writing going on to the government to say to tell them that it's completely unacceptable to force NHS staff to have um, this intervention. And that was one of the things that made the government do a U-turn, wasn't it? And that never appeared on the mainstream media. People think these things just happen, and so then all of a sudden you can't have something that's absolutely critically essential for public health, that all NHS staff need this jab. Then all of a sudden they don't. And this is the whole history of every single thing you heard from the government during the whole of 2020. Absolutely flip flop on everything. And their ability to actually have a reasoned conversation about anything was zero. It was all simplistic mantra. But sorry, you just asked me a question, and you said, "What was my opinion?" Did you say, Dave?
Yeah, what was your fears? What were the sort of moments?
Yeah.
What was the
Uh,
equation for you?
right. That's a very good question. I'm just trying to think now. Um, I already knew, yes. So I already knew from my reading that this. So first of all, this wasn't a vaccination. Um, and I've since then developed my beliefs about vaccination too. Um, I've had more vaccinations, you can imagine, um, and it was a completely different technology that was being used. Um, it allegedly, according to the um, the governments, was a new technology which had been suddenly, you know, pulled through as something that was going to work. Well, I knew already that you can't just science doesn't work like that. You can't suddenly just create um, a very advanced, complex technology like that. And I was beginning to read more and more about it, and I realised that, um, in a nutshell, it was also a very dangerous technology. Um, and I went, yeah. So that's a simple answer.
And
Um,
speed as well. Speed, it can't, like you say, it was a novel technology. This was never communicated to the public, that this was a
no,
novel gene-based therapeutic. I mean, one of my famous bans from LinkedIn and YouTube was when I'm holding the documents up from Moderna and Pfizer, and it says, again, I'll have to paraphrase for the purposes of this. So it said something to the effect of this is a gene immunomodulatory therapy, or no, this is not a conventional vaccine. It is a
yeah,
immunomodulatory gene therapy. This will never be brought to brought out as a new technology due to its regulatory and quality control issues, or words to that effect. And I'm sat there reading it, running my finger along the document. And I get banned from LinkedIn for spreading misinformation from
yeah.
reading Moderna and Pfizer documents live on a radio show of some description. I can't remember now, but it's just mental. But that was
That's where
never.
you're at.
That
That's
was
where you're
never.
at.
Yeah, I mean, I got a wonderful letter from the Royal College of GPs, Brian Mulholland, saying the questions posed to him by a third party were, why aren't we telling people what's in the vaccine, the ingredients, and why aren't we telling them that there's limited safety data? And the answer was very black and white. We haven't got any safety data, short, medium, or long term, and we don't know what's in the vial. So it's a very different conversation if you've got Doris pulling up a sleeve and you say, "Hello, Doris. got this new gene technology that's never been used on humans before, laced with lipid nanoparticles. Don't know
Yeah,
what else is in there. Don't know what else is in there. We've got no safety
yeah,
data. Happy
yeah,
for me to proceed. I think they tell you to, but it was not like that in the vaccine centre. It's very much roll your sleeve up, Doris. Are you pregnant? Strangely,
yeah,
they always asked if they were pregnant, and they didn't. If you were pregnant or you weren't pregnant, they didn't ask you to leave the queue. It was one of the questions on the check-in list, and then
yeah,
soon they're moving in on the pregnant women, telling them it was safe and effective. But
yeah.
mental times. I'm gonna just throw some terms at you and see what your experience of these were. Um, COVID deaths. So COVID deaths. Did you see any things that raised concerns? I don't want to lead you into this question, but did you see any concerning documentation of deaths being COVID when they
Oh,
weren't?
oh, sure. No, I really only believe during the year that year I witnessed what I'm counting in my mind. I think probably two people who sadly died. One of them was he had very complex issues, medical issues, and it's a very tragic death, and he died, but that was just because of it was unknown. That was on the ward. Nobody really knew actually what the cause was in the end. But I don't know what was recorded on his. I didn't get that. I didn't ever get to see that part. Um, and then there was another lady, a lady who died. And so I didn't see many deaths, which is interesting.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know what was actually recorded, but I am very well aware from the literature and from listening to people, the funeral directors and so on, who are calling it out. Um, they were putting writing, and from people I spoke with around and about, they were telling me that COVID had been written as the cause of death, when evidently there was a lot of other factors, and there was no evidence particularly of there being a different respiratory disease or something.
This is the problem with this testing on, using a poorly sensitive, unspecific test on entry to hospital for other reasons. So you could have a perforated appendix and succumb to that in theatre and bleed out, exsanguinate, because your positive test came back. It would at least be mentioned on part two, which is the sort of any other factors related to the death, and that would be added to the yellow and black ticker tape that was riding across the screens every evening, with the usual government slideshow that was going on. What was your experience of DNARs? Were you out before that sort of started to happen? The DNAR slapping blanket policy DNARs on
Yeah,
entry to the hospital.
I think there was a change going on. I'm not sure on my dates on that. It certainly, I know that happened. Um, when I was in there, I have a feeling it might have been happening in 2020. It probably was. I'm not a good historian on that.
Right, it all blurs, doesn't it? I
It
find more
does.
picking out the details and the chronology of these things. But again, I wasn't working in hospitals at the time, but you're hearing these third-party accounts of, DNARs being put on people with learning disabilities. Anyone over 60 that had, comorbidities would be given a DNAR without a discussion.
Yes.
Again, very unethical. You involve people in DNAR. You have to have a pretty tricky conversation with them about, if your heart were to stop. It's not as they make it out on Casualty that you couple of pumps of the chest and you sat upright with a cup of tea. You've got to talk about the trauma and stuff, but you have to have the conversation. You can't presume that people wouldn't want CPR. But there were these policies going on where, we were doing it in primary care. We were seeing, it's nursing homes were just you'd fill in red forms for, not personally, but the other doctors would be filling in red forms, on everyone named on that nursing home's admission sheets, just because, they were crumbly and not worthy of resuscitated. If they were, it's just some very strange things going on.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, very much a protocol driven. Is that the word protocol?
Did you ever see much of midazolam, the midazolam aspects of things?
No, I studied it. I got very clear reports. I saw the reports of the. I've got the sharp evidence, the robust evidence here.
What are the headlines for those who don't know what midazolam is and what the headlines are of its misuse, shall I say? I don't want to lead you on that.
Yeah. talk to a very rusty nurse here. So midazolam, is it an anxiolytic,
Yeah,
basically? Yeah. So that's a drug that's given to help. One of the things it does is to help somebody be less anxious, and it might be given for other reasons as well. I think it's helpful sometimes in a procedure that's done. For example, if you're having an endoscopy, a tube looking down inside you to help. It helps people to forget, doesn't it? And
it's
immediately
conscious sedation, is what you're saying. So you can
comes to sedation.
people have no evidence, no recollection of a scope. But mainly, it's an end of life, isn't it? You use it when somebody is in their
Yeah.
literal dying phase.
Yeah, and then very carefully. So it would always be a very last approach. So I worked in medicine for the elderly for a third of my time, and there would come a point where there would be conventionally often some diamorphine and some midazolam and various other drugs there if really needed. And we always have our first line approach of trying to deal with the, you know, what is the anxiety, what's the cause of it, a non-medical approach first of all. And then there come a time when occasionally we almost reluctantly say, yeah, let's just then we've tried everything else, we'll try a little bit. I think we always went for the pain relief first, a very low dose, 1.25 of diamorphine, a milligram of diamorphine or something, to see how we are. Obviously we wouldn't leave people suffering, and then you work it out. And midazolam would be on the other side of things. We wouldn't want to give midazolam instead of pain relief, because if it was pain that was causing the problem, midazolam wouldn't deal with the pain. But midazolam also is a respiratory depressant, isn't it? So it slows and decreases your respiration rate, is it, or
Yeah, and
depth?
it
Is that right?
does it even better when it's co-administered with Dimorph as well. It's
Oh,
synergistic.
right, right. And so I believe we always gave that well and with caution, and then we often reverse it as well, not continue it. Sometimes somebody would need it more continuously. But it would be midazolam was done with great care, and we'd be watching their respirator and everything. And then all of a sudden, I know, what was happening in nursing homes. There was a massive order of midazolam, which went, I think it was Matt Hancock, who was one of the major people in that. And there was orders being given to nursing homes to administer midazolam to people who had a diagnosis of COVID. I don't know what their actual condition was like, whether they were just PCR positive. I don't know the details. I can't remember now. And they were asked to give midazolam to people. But in any case, if it was a COVID type illness, that's an illness where you're respiratory in distress, aren't you? So, in my understanding, you wouldn't want to give midazolam to somebody who's struggling with their breathing. But I'm being a bit simplistic, but there was certainly
Rocket
being.
science, is it? You bang on. You wouldn't give a respiratory distress patient a respiratory
No,
suppressant.
I worked in
That-
respiratory medicine for 4 years, and
Mm.
yeah, very closely with people, and so and they were also being asked to give a high dose, a particular high dose. I can't remember the numbers now. Midazolam.
They'd be going in. That's my experience of it. Really, is that they were going in very zealously, I'd say, or
Yeah,
gung-ho or trigger happy on that. And that came from primary care because, again, as I mentioned with the blanket red forms, DNAR forms, we were asked to do anticipatory meds for this glut of new releases into the nursing homes where you'd set up the district nurses with the syringe drivers and the stat doses of all of these end of life drugs, and only to hear as soon as it's been prescribed, 2 weeks later you get the death certificate through for Doris died of COVID, even though she had cellulitis, for example, and the end of life drugs were. And you look at the doses that were being used, and they weren't, like you say, normally you start low and up titrate to effect. You've got your flumazenil at the ready, you've got
absolutely,
your naloxone at the ready in case you
absolutely.
overcook it.
Reverse.
But
Yeah,
you're hearing about syringe drivers put on people that were not end of life. End of life is distressing. I've seen it many times. You can get respiratory secretions and anxiety as your livers and your kidney fail. You become nauseous and in pain. So those drugs are for those specific purposes. Cancer's not a very nice way to go. But it was this kind of giving it to Doris, who's got cellulitis, who's become a bit delirious, and then the syringe drive. And I've seen it in my own Cornwall practices where people have been bumped off bumped off, and I'm not hiding the fact they were killed.
Yeah, they
Killed.
were. Yeah, they were. So we had a situation in our nursing homes where our elders were being murdered by registered nurses, and so those nurses should be have been struck off.
Have you got any examples just to share? Don't name names, but what do you mean by murdered? Because people wonder whether we're sort of, because I've just said killed, you just said murdered.
Well,
And
I suppose
people are watching.
murdered in the sense of they're giving they're suddenly following orders to give a higher dose of midazolam, much higher, to people who a may not need it, um, or not have it and in a high doses. So that's like that's doing harm, isn't it? So why are you doing harm? So maybe murder isn't right. I don't know, but if the person ends up dying, you're directly harming the person, and they ended up dying. So maybe my use of murder is not right. but
Well, I disagree. I've seen murder, so I'll give you an example quickly. A guy I was seeing over
Well, I
Christmas.
suppose it's intent. I'm not implying intent, but there's no. If you're a registered nurse, your duty is to know what you're doing.
And we know when we give these drugs, there's this ethical principle of what they call it the doctrine of double effect. So when you're giving it, you are hastening death, you're bringing
Yeah.
it forward, but at the expense of relieving symptoms of the patient. But this one guy who was a perfectly functioning 70-year-old guy, I'd gone to see him for a perianal abscess. He was acting delirious, had a fever, tachycardia, high heart rate, for those that don't know. Gave him some augmentin, comoxiclav antibiotic over the Christmas period, checked in on him after Christmas, did a quick Boxing Day check-in. He's doing fine, much better. About a week later, he deteriorated, gone into sort of sepsis again, similar presentation, delirium, tachycardia, confused, away with the fairies. And again, he just obviously relapsed into what had happened. And again, this area, a perianal area, had been starting to weep. So there's obviously an infection. Anyway, he has a syringe driver put up on him in his home. I remember reading the death
Mm,
certificate of this guy because the doctor had registered it as old age. And I saw the scanned letter from the family thanking this doctor for his care towards their father in the
mm,
end stages. And what he'd done is he'd gone in, filled in anticipatory meds for this guy who really just needed to go to the surgeons and have his wound debrided and
mm,
perhaps some IV antibiotics killed.
mm.
There's no two ways about it. He was
Yeah,
killed.
yeah, yeah, definitely. It's really,
This was, this is stuff that we've seen, and
yeah.
Jackie Devoy's done a lot of work on this. There's that case of that guy at the moment that they're talking about with there's an investigation that he went in with gout.
Mm,
And he put it this way, he didn't leave the hospital. So there's this whole public investigation about that, about midazolam deaths, and
mm.
we've not just cooked this up out of nowhere for the sake of a conspiracy theory to scare people. This was going on.
Yeah, no, we've got the figures, the precise figures on it as well, haven't we? Um, yeah, it's very precise.
Times. So let's say, just to sort of wind it down now, you've got a room
Yeah.
full of doctors and nurses. I always ask this question. You've got a mixture of COVID cultists who are still lining up for their 18th jab. You've got some that are awake but petrified. What would you say to them to get them to join the ranks of the conspiracy theorists, for want of a better word, of the critical thinkers? What would you say?
Do you mean what would I say to the to who to
To,
the
to get them to sort of, I talk a lot about the duty of candor. I guess that's
yeah,
what I'm trying to lean into here is that, we have responsibilities as a doctor, nurses, not only to remember why we became those people in the beginning, but also if we mess up, we have to put our hands up. And we see that across the board in medicine. In fact, in certain instances in my past, you have to acknowledge that you've done things wrong when you haven't
yes.
just to keep the public confidence high and to rebuild that sacred doctor-patient relationship. So it's 2025, you're in a lecture theatre when we used to do grand rounds back in the day when you used to educate each other and share
Oh
educational
yes.
opinion. That
Oh
they've gone from
yes.
medical practice.
No, no.
But the
So,
floor is yours and you're just appealing to your colleagues to speak out. What words of wisdom have you got?
yeah, I would definitely say that it's really important to if there's any question what we've got over anything, it's our professional duty, our private professional pride and professional duty, putting everybody else out of the equation to really listen to that. And I'm just talking about internal, nobody else needs to know for a start. And to really listen into that and ask questions and take pride in doing so. And so I always say to myself, I left my decision to leave the NMC register was a professional decision. It was so that I could not do harm, so then I could hopefully go on and do some good. So I'd say do start there, do some reading, do some thinking, put it all together, think about the consequences. Why are you there? Why are you there? Are you there because you want a paycheck? Or are you there for other reasons? What are your motives? Just ask questions of yourself. Um, uh, and go there and don't think yourself stupid for it. It's your professional duty to do reflective practice regularly. And it can be private or for yourself. Start there and keep going, and then just make a good decision about what to do. But we've got to stop doing harm. We've got to. I'm in this situation again now because, without naming the situation, I'm working as a support worker in a company. The whole world is upside down, and at the moment, I've not needed to do anything that I don't agree with, but I can see that I could be asked to at any moment. I can see the situation I'm in. So I'm making that decision myself, and it's not going to be easy, you know. But on some reflection I've been doing, I've been going, no, I'm thinking very carefully, you know, because I don't want to end up supporting something that's wrong. So it's counting the cost, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean we're in professions where we are bound by not only our professional guidances and our obligations, but you mentioned it, reflection. We're encouraged to reflect. We're encouraged to critically think. We're encouraged to fess up, with the duty of candor. There's all sorts of things we're encouraged to do until you do it, and then you face the consequences. So I understand. I
Yeah,
mean, I understand. We talked earlier about the deliberate exhaustion of doctors and nurses. You're not going to go and read the ONS data on or the UK HSA data on COVID morbidity and mortality across the UK and Scotland at the end of a 14-hour day when you've had to self-catheterize a number of times and you've had a biscuit, once about 15 hours ago.
oh,
So
don't get me onto the healthy food they gave us one during the COVID pandemic.
yeah, it was
When
all
they were-
pizzas and biscuits, wasn't it? It was.
yeah, sorry, no, that's right.
But yeah, it's a case of asking. My appeal is for people to look themselves in the mirror, and it's 2025 now. We're at a really crucial juncture in that. Ironically, I'm being charged with bringing the profession into disrepute and affecting negatively the confidence in the profession. Well, sweet irony, I would flip that right around and say they're the ones that are doing exactly what they're accusing me of. Own up.
Yeah,
And we're at a time where now there's a big confidence issue in the NHS. There's a lot of people. In fact, there was a published study from America showing their confidence pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and it showed that confidence has been shot. And doctors happily going to just pick up their paycheck and ignore the fact and enjoy their quiet days because people are holding on to their symptoms. And we certainly saw that at the beginning of the pandemic. People held on to their symptoms because they didn't want to, know, take the time of these extremely busy doctors. So we've got to be careful because they're going to be direct health repercussions of a public health confidence issue in the doctors because people will not go to the doctor about that rectal bleeding they've had for 6 months or that weight loss that's crept up on them or that memory issue that they've had. They're just not going to go, and that's going to lead to another wave of comorbidity like we did see at the beginning of the pandemic where outpatients were shut, everything elective was stopped, and that has knock-on effects, doesn't it, in terms of
yeah,
cancer care slowed it down, so people are then getting sicker, and we can't just like put our heads in the sand and continue this ostrich syndrome, as I call it. That's the real pandemic here, ostrich syndrome amongst NHS staff. It's particularly very virulent at the moment.
most most certainly. You just touched on something that's really important, and I think it all comes down to words. So it's not good enough for people or employers or com- companies to say, you said, oh, we don't want to reduce the confidence, and all they say, we've got to get right back down. We've got to strip everything away and get right back down to simple basics of what are we there for. Because if we're running around as we generally are, being really busy with a certain level of job satisfaction, it's not difficult to have job satisfaction if you're quite busy tidying things up or doing things. But we're missing the point, and we're actually doing harm at the same time, or missing or neglecting to see what needs to be done at the same time. That's what we need to be really looking at. Get back to the base. And so when we live in this age now at the moment of people twisting words. I saw that all the way through 2020, these politicians twisting words around really cleverly. And they even began to get to a point where you could see that us people who are exposing the truth and saying truthful things, the the people who are pro COVID lockdowns, pro PCR swabbing, pro masking up, pro um, COVID jabs, etc. These people would then latch onto our words and repeat them back. It's all war of the words with the mind, and they play them back. They would twist it just slightly so you couldn't notice it. So I think I'd say to those people, just really strip everything back and think, what are we here for?
Do you
And
think there are genuinely doctors out there that think that the
yeah,
jab is safe and effective still?
yeah,
And we've seen even this week, I've seen some sickening adverts for the NHS Spring booster, I think we're on to now. And are these doctors genuinely believing that you need to be boosted 7 times for this disease? There's pretty much, I mean, I've never heard of a pandemic last 5 years in multiple waves named after octopuses and Omicron and all these different variants. I mean, they're taking the piss a little bit now with the names of some of these variants. But do you reckon those doctors are genuinely believing it still, or they're just following the orders still?
yeah. I suppose it must. I'm just. I've not got any evidence for what I'm saying, but I'm just thinking. I suppose it's a spectrum, isn't it? There must be people who perhaps genuinely believe things. But then we've got to ask the question, and this is a really difficult question to ask because we live in this high tech society, don't we? And there are hard questions to ask, like, do I really understand what I'm doing? And do I really understand why I'm doing it? And I've always had the view that not many other people around me have shared. And it's this debate, isn't it? Do we want quality or do we want quantity? Um, and I always tend to argue for the quality.
Mm.
But then, of course, if we want quality, we're going to not have as much quantity of care. But I think we somehow need to go into a place of really asking questions. Do I really understand what I'm doing? Do I really, you know, we need more of those questions being asked in senior places. So the medical profession definitely has a duty to be asking and it has to be an individual question. Every medic has to ask because I'm a nurse. So, if a doctor-led decision, I might not have this, or I'm not a scientist in that way. I'm not going to have that level of understanding of the procedure. I could easily do something. So I think more people can just see the joy of uh, asking questions and working out whether they understand it. But then there's a cost to that, isn't there? So
No, I agree. Final question. Would you
yeah,
go back to the NHS ever? And what would it take to convince you?
I'd love to go back to the NHS if not on two bases. Number one, I say it to my situation now. Number one would be if an organisation was really up for having mature conversations, and we could have regular forums where everybody sits around and there's nothing taboo, and we can just really work things through and call things what they are. Call it big business from pharma, call it out. Everybody knows it's there. And just be mature about things. I'd love to go back if we could have that, and research-based healthcare, where we really are trying to do that in a genuine way, not just to a certain level. And I would go back if we could come away a little bit from some of these technologies that we're using, which in my opinion we most certainly shouldn't be using, because we can see that they're doing a great deal of harm, and we certainly don't understand them, or some people do.
So I'd say these are conditions that are fairly reasonable, adult, mature conversations that have been lacking. There's been a
Yeah,
shutdown of debate, censorship of the
yeah,
dissenters, vilification of the refuseniks, rather than just saying, okay, because I don't remember a single debate or person to provide me some information that says safe and effective about these jabs or any of the measures, really, lockdowns, distancing, and all the rest of it. But just
no,
that conversation. We've got two people here on this call. I've got probably about by current retirement dates, about 30 years left in the NHS. You've got all this experience, and you've got what, 10, 15, 20 years left in the NHS, but we're sat here 50 years down on NHS service for a doctor and a nurse because we've dared to question and vocalise what we actually are professionally obliged to do. You know,
Yes.
voice concerns if you've got safety concerns. Speak up and whistleblow if you have, you know,
Yeah.
ethical concerns, etc. And then here we are, sat in a podcast where we're breaking
Yeah.
the silence. As it says a lot, doesn't it? We're breaking the silence.
I'm about to possibly, I can see it. I might have to do it again. I might have to go through the same thing again. So I'm preparing myself, but I know that this is one thing I would say to the people. I would say, you know, that if you know you're doing the wrong thing, it's really harmful to you. Really hard. You might not know it, but every time we're doing that, it hurts us. And I think for me personally, I'd rather have the pain of being poor or not so well off or hated or whatever, or that doesn't matter. But if you've got a clean conscience, then you can move forward and do some good things. There's always a way through.
Yeah, and you change your mindset, don't you? We've both been that flogged, exhausted nurse and doctor at the end of the day, and the little
Yeah,
bit of bit of you go to bed with that warm, fuzzy feeling that you've helped some people. But I've replaced that now. I've replaced that now with a clear conscience that I've done what I'm supposed
yeah.
to do. You're the same. We've left. I'll call it Stockholm syndrome, working in the NHS. I've left the abusive relationship, and I don't think I'll ever go back. I'm slightly different to you, Fergus. I'd like to keep
No,
skills, but when I do these shifts that come up sporadically, I'm back to my old ways of, being a farmer pimp, which is not what I've done
no,
in the last 2 or 3 years. I've been more of a holistic doctor, and time to listen is one of the big things. You get 10 minutes with a patient in the NHS where I'll get an hour and a half, 2 hours with people who get in touch through my drcartland.com service. So,
no. It's
yes,
really good.
you've been
Well,
amazing. It's been a really insightful conversation, and I think this will be well received by the viewers. And really, really appreciate your time.
well, thank you very much. And can I just say thank you to, well, yourself, but I also want to say thank you to all the doctors who are, and all the people who are standing out. And I call you sort of the new Harley Street of doctors. To be honest,
Harley Street, but without Harley Street money.
I genuinely mean that, but not Harley Street, but a different Harley Street. Yeah.
Yeah, the new
Thank
way of
you.
doing things, and that's what needs to come really. Just to finish off, we need to find a new way, because I don't think the people who are trying to protect their careers under the guise of the NHS realise that AI is coming. We've seen a massive, issue around PAs, physicians associates, and sort of de-skilling of the profession as we speak. And these jobs, are they going to be there? Is the pension going to be there in 30 years, 40 years? I just don't know the answers to these things, but these people are protecting that career aspect of their life with everything that they've got, where it may not be there in 20, 30 years. And I can vouch for the fact that the NHS doesn't care once you're kicked off once you're in the skip. Once they've broken you, they don't care. You're out. They just replace you with another one.
Yeah.
And so it goes on the treadmill of NHS staff. And when you break, they say, don't they, that are you resilient enough for this role? And there's that question about resilience. But on that note,
Yeah.
Fergus, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll get this out to the public sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much, Dave. My
All right,
pleasure.
take care.
Dr.
Take care.
Cartland, thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.